Prepare to experience the strongest radio allowable by law. Secrets will be revealed. Myths dispelled. From the studio gym where excuses never apply, it's Superhuman Radio with your host, Carl Lenore.
Welcome back to another episode of Superhuman Radio. Today's a really important show. I'm going to ask everybody right up front to share this show as much as possible because I'm sure it will be removed from some of the platforms. We have a backup video platform now when YouTube removes one of our shows. So you can always find it at superhumanradio.net. We're going to be talking with a guy that I've known for a really long time, have a lot of respect for. In fact, I think his first appearance on this show was before he even had his Ph.D. I met him through Sally Fallon over at the Weston A. Price Foundation. When I wanted to know things about vitamin D and vitamin A, Dr. Chris Masterjohn was the guy I went to. In fact, I've learned a lot from him over the years, and I credit him a lot of times when I say things like people should look at parathyroid hormone when trying to dial in vitamin D levels. I learned that from him. And he's a straight shooter. He's not a clickbait guy. Everything he talks about is real science. And as a result, he's developed a huge following. It's funny. The narrative has all been about wait for the vaccine. But the NIH and the CDC really haven't given us any advice on possible therapeutic approaches to either avoid COVID or minimize the symptoms. I know, wear the mask, but the mask doesn't work. We all know that now. Let's stop. Santa Claus isn't real. The Easter Bunny's not real, and the mask doesn't work. But Chris has been talking about legitimate science-based approaches to both minimizing the risk of catching COVID and also things that you can do to minimize the symptoms if you do have it. And we're going to cover all of them on today's show. It's going to be a great show. Of course, I have to thank our title sponsor, Legendary Foods, makers of the Tasty Pastry. If you haven't tried it, the Tasty Pastry started out to be an alternative to the Pop-Tart, and it's so much more. It really tastes like you're eating cake. It tastes better than the Pop-Tart. Your kids will love it. That's the acid test. Kids don't like protein bars. You can't get your kids to take a protein bar to school and say, here, eat this instead of your lunch. But they'll eat these. In fact, you'll have to fight them to get them away from them. It comes in a multitude of fantastic flavors, 20 grams of high-quality, high-leucine protein, less than 1 gram of sugar. And for those of us who are low-carb or keto people, net 4 or 5 net carbs. Go to shrnetwork.biz/legendary. Use the code SHR10 to save 10% off. I promise you, you will not want to be without them ever. Welcome back to the show, Dr. Now I can say Dr. Chris Masterjohn. How you doing?
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
My fellow Brooklynite too.
At one time.
Yeah. Oh no. Oh, okay. We did the same thing. We went from Bed-Stuy to South Ozone Park, Queens, Richmond Hill area.
Cool.
So, I consider you part of academia because you have been a lifelong student, and I believe the best people to listen to are lifelong students. To tell you the truth. But I was very refreshed to hear your vocal opinions about this whole pandemic. And it takes a lot of balls, to be honest with you, to be on that side, as you know, because we are not liked if we don't go with the popular comments and thoughts today. But you have really published some fantastic stuff. What happened? When did you decide to take this very risky approach? Because you blew up on social media with all your stuff. Why step into this?
Well, there was a couple phases, and to be honest, like the first phase didn't really involve any action on my part. I basically just kept doing the same thing I always do. So what I've been doing for pretty much my whole career is trying to break down complex science into usable things that we can help do to improve our health. And I've done that, primarily with vitamins and minerals for most of my career. And when COVID hit, I just kept doing that. It just turned out that it became exceedingly clear at the beginning of the pandemic that my own audience really didn't want anything from me that was generic vitamin and mineral information. They wanted to know what can they do nutritionally to protect themselves from this new virus that we know very little about, but which may turn out to be really dangerous and everyone's talking about. So I, for the better part of 2020, I was basically going to PubMed and the preprint servers. The preprints are scientific articles that are destined for the final peer review process, but haven't been peer reviewed yet. And because there was so much research coming out so fast, there were basically a couple hundred preprints coming out every day. And so for the first, maybe between February, March-ish 2020 and September 2020, I was basically spending all day long going to preprint servers, reading through a couple hundred titles, figuring out which ones I should read, and then from there figuring out which ones were useful enough to write about for my newsletter, and then from there figuring out which one should go into my COVID guide, which is now in its 7th edition.
I didnn realize that. Plug that right now, please. I didn't realize.
Well, if you go to chrismasterjohnphd.com/COVID guide, COVIDGUIDE, COVID guide, that's kind of my most up-to-date information about what you should do to protect yourself. And it's $10, although it's also free with a bunch of other stuff that you could get, and that just is a way to help support me spending huge amounts of time reading all the research. But and of course, everyone who bought the first edition has the 7th edition now. So the format that I've done is, once you buy it once, or once you get it free with something else once, you get the updates for free. And so that's kind of been a gift that keeps on giving for people that want to know what they can do to protect themselves from COVID. But anyway, for the better part of 2020, I was basically just researching everything that was coming out that could relate to practical stuff you could do, especially related to herbs, vitamins, or minerals. My core expertise, not solely limited to that, but mostly that, to see what people could do to protect themselves. That's what my audience wanted from me. That was basically what I was already doing. It's just I was, taking my core expertise and making it relevant to what's happening at the moment. Now, given that, at the end of 2020, when things started really getting more
political,
well, I wouldn't say that. I mean, there was politics going back to the beginning, but as the vaccine began to emerge as the one thing that you must do, I mean, almost in a religious sense, like the one thing that you have to do unto the remission of sins, without which you can't be saved. As things moved in that direction, right? I was already of the mindset that there were many things that you could do to protect yourself from COVID, because I'd been spending, 8 to 12 hours a day researching them for the last 7 months. Right. So like the idea that there was one thing that you can do to protect yourself from COVID and nothing else can do anything. I mean, it's like trying to tell someone that the street's not going to be there when they walk outside and they're going to fall through to the center of the earth. You're like, what are you talking about? I've been walking outside of my house every day of my life, and the street's always there. Right. And so, I mean, no one could pull that wool over my eyes. I've been looking at, many hundreds of studies that have been coming out on the many things, the many things that, have whatever potential or confirmed effect in protecting you from COVID. So I just kept doing what I was doing at that point. But then as more and more people really wanted to know about the vaccine, the same way that people really wanted to know about nutrition and herbs in March or April 2020, at that point, my audience also wants me to look at the vaccine stuff, and which is extremely logical, because although I'm not a vaccinologist, nutrition, I'm a nutrition scientist, not a dietitian. So a dietitian or a nutritionist learns how to tell people what to eat. And right. I'm a nutrition scientist. The nutrition scientist studies molecular biology, cellular biology, and biochemistry, and applies it to what you eat. So, things like PCR studies and stuff like this. Like I have actually have all my old lab notes sitting next to me. I'm going to scan them and then shred them, but I have like protocols that I've written to do PCR on stuff right next to me for my nutrition studies, because we would use it to study gene expression. And so, anything about vaccinology or about the molecular biology of the virus or the vaccine are things that are well within my
Purview.
I would say proficiency, not even at least competence, if not proficiency to analyze, even though they're not in my core expertise the way that vitamins and minerals are. And so I just kept analyzing research and publishing about it, but there developed a kind of, I don't know if it's like a cult or a religion or a psyop campaign or whatever you want to call it, but there developed this idea that if you say anything about the risks of the vaccine or suggesting that it's like less than 95% effective in some context, or that there's something we don't know about it that we should be careful about it, that you personally are responsible for everyone who has died.
Yes, right? I know.
So I literally had people telling me I was doing nothing different. I wasn't an activist of any type at that point. I was just reading the research and posting about it like I'd always done. And now now I'm responsible for mass graves in Mexico.
It's crazy.
I even had someone who was not a close friend, but a paying member of my group, a doctor, and like a conference friend, someone I was on very friendly terms with, question whether I was human. And upon because I posted something not vaguely, but I posted something somewhat critical of the vaccines. And upon further clarification, it turned out that this person was saying that if I could walk into an ICU and see the people dying there and not change my tune, that then I was clearly not human. But either way, I mean, this person's questioning whether I'm human, right? And then even Instagram threatened me with account deletion for an article that was on the protective effect of arginine that did not mention vaccines anywhere. And what they said was that I was causing physical harm to people by disincentivizing them from getting vaccinated. But I didn't say anything about vaccines at all in that article, which means that according to Instagram, if you share information that anything that is not the vaccine protects against COVID, you are causing physical harm to people, and you are responsible for them not getting vaccinated and dying. So you said, when did I, never, I didn't do anything different, right? But then the final change, though, the one thing that happened that actually made me change my behavior was when the mandate started hitting New York City and I started seeing tens of thousands of people around me lose their jobs or have their jobs threatened over this. I got kicked out of my gym for not getting the vaccine. And that was just kind of I'll turn half my home office into a gym. I got within 3 days I had a power rack set up. And I'm like, well, now I can squat barefoot in my boxers and do work between my sets on my laptop. Cool. And it was an inconvenience to have to buy a power rack all of a sudden out of nowhere, but I didn't care that much. And like if I was dating someone, it would probably be complicated to find, to where I wanted to take them would be more complicated now because of all the venues that there's a lot of don't ask, don't tell going on in New York City, but there's a lot of venues that you show your papers for and all that. But none of that really would have made me into like a anti-mandate activist the way that I am now. And that's really been driven by just the fact that, in 17 when I decided that I didn't want anyone telling me where to be at 9:30 in the morning, and I quit my job with no business plan and managed to succeed over the years. I had no idea that I was giving myself the freedom to decide what to inject into my own body 4 years later. And I think that should not, a high IQ, luck, and total intransigence in not wanting anyone to be able to tell you what your schedule is like should not be the bar needed for you to be able to make the decision of what to put
Right.
into your own body, with the consequence that you might not be able to feed your family. I just think that's utterly disgusting. And so I feel like everyone else should have the freedom that I did, and that's what really got me into being an activist against the mandates.
There's something called sovereign immunity. That if someone said to me, "Hey, Carl, if you could do one thing in politics, what would it be?" I would do away with sovereign immunity so that politicians who make bad decisions can be punished. Right now, sovereign immunity keeps politicians who make bad decisions, and some of them are driven by corrupt ideals, but they can't be punished when they're in office. They make a decision, people die. Oh, sorry, I was a politician. You or I do something that makes people die, we go to jail. If I could do one thing, I would make sovereign immunity go away, because what has happened to this country and what has been foisted upon the American people is it should be punishable. All the things that we were silenced for saying in 2020, like this is no worse than the flu. Guess what? Now we know that across all age groups, it isn't. I mean, old people die more readily from the flu. Old people die more readily from the COVID. Obese people who have comorbidities die more readily from the flu. And so we were silenced for saying it's like the flu. We were told that we like you said, you're really responsible for the death of people because you're influencing their decisions. And the vaccine is a failure. Like anybody who keeps this is like the king with no clothes. Shh, don't tell him he's naked. They'll beat us up if we say that he's naked. The vaccine's a failure. Israel just had their 4th or 5th booster, and their COVID rates have gone through the roof. Scotland just announced that they're done with the vaccine. It doesn't work. But here in the United States, don't talk about the fact that the vaccine is a failure. I want to see people punished.
Real quick point on Israel. It's stunning to me that someone reached out to me at the beginning of the pandemic from Israel, and we organized a RCT to test a cocktail of nutrients, and we had everything approved, and we had the hospitals and doctors all lined up, and we had to stop proceeding the trial because Israel's COVID cases went to 0 before the vaccine. And so it's stunning the way that Israel pioneered the vaccine mandates and wound up with the one of the worst, if not the worst, outlying, not even on the line, but outlier in COVID cases.
Right.
That's nuts. But yeah, I haven't thought about the sovereign immunity angle. That's a pretty interesting idea. I guess that, I think we should hit this from all angles and leave no stone uncovered. That requires a higher bar because it would require the courts to convict someone on top of just being able to accuse them. But I don't know. I think that's a cool idea. But lawsuits that are happening right now, I think, are real important. And I'm very interested in Angela McArdle, who is currently the chair of the LA Libertarian Party. She visited New York and is pioneering the organization of a referendum of the city's charter to be voted on in November that would ban the mayor from making executive orders around these mandates. And I think that's also a very interesting idea, especially since it's quite easy to get it on the ballot. And if we campaign and have a year to win over the hearts and minds of the people, I think it actually does have a good chance of passing in November. But yeah, I mean, hit it from all angles. Right now, you don't live in New York anymore, do you?
I'm in Louisville, Kentucky, but we're just as
Yeah.
bad. We have a liberal mayor here, and we have a liberal governor, and they've done the lockdowns. We didn't even have the cases anybody else had. They locked the whole city down. They just overreacted, you know?
Yeah, yeah. Well, in New York right now, I mean, multiple times a week, close to every night now, there are restaurant sit-ins where people who without vaccine papers go to restaurants and demand service, and then they usually what happens is they call the cops, and the cops arrest them for trespassing. But it's amazing. The other day I was watching a video of one of the cops. Sometimes the cops won't arrest them, and but they won't. It'll just be a stalemate. One time, I think it was Panera, they just said, "All right, we're just going to shut the place down." They closed the whole place because they didn't want to call the cops on the people. But I'm watching a video, I'm listening to the cops, right? And the cops, there's a mayor's vaccine mandate and the statewide mask mandate. And there's don't ask, don't tell going on all over the city. Like I very frequently walk in with no mask to a restaurant that has a mask mandate sign and a vaccine mandate sign, says you got to show your papers, and I walk in, I get the food, I sit down, I eat, and nothing happens.
Yeah.
Right? Happens all the time. But the cops only come when the businesses call them, right? And then I'm watching this cop, and the cop says, well, if this restaurant doesn't want to serve you, you got to go somewhere else. So these cops that are arresting these people can't even defend the mayor's mandate that they're arresting them. In theory, right? The restaurant's mandating this because the mayor mandated them to. But the cops will only come if the restaurant asks them to, and they tell the people go eat at a different restaurant, right? Yeah, right. So the cops aren't actually enforcing the mayor's mandate. No one is enforcing it, right? There's this really, I mean, in a way, it's very much suggesting that the centralized state and city powers are basically undermining their credibility and enforcement power to the point where we don't really have a centralized state of any sort now, and the cops will just defend the businesses if the businesses want them to. Like on the surface, one thing is happening, but what's actually happening is something totally different.
Right.
And so I think we're at a very critical point where I don't know where it's going, but it's very, very clear that there is not the enforcement power nor the will of the people to actually have these mandates be enforced in the city in any kind of uniform or logical, coherent way. And so something has to burst in one direction or another.
Yeah. I didn't even know about these sit-ins because you don't see that on the news. They don't tell you that's what's going on.
Your news should be Leroy Johnson of Leroy Press. This guy, I don't know how he takes footage and then asks it to be licensed by news places. I don't know how this guy shows up at like every single thing that you would want to catch on camera, but somehow he's everywhere at the exact camera angle you would want. But if you he's on Twitter and he's on Instagram, Leroy Johnson, Leroy Press. I mean, he's the guy that has video footage of everything that's actually going on.
What I want to do right now is I want to take our first break a little early so we can come back and we can start going through the list of things. And I want to look at things from two standpoints, right? Preventative and therapeutic. And we'll just go, and I'm going from your previous YouTube videos. So this is all within your wheelhouse, okay?
Sounds good.
Plug your website again so people can go and get the book too if they can't stay for the whole show.
ChrisMasterjohnPhD.com. And if you do /COVID guide, that's where you'll get the COVID guide.
All right, stay tuned. We'll be right back with more Superhuman Radio. Don't go away. I would easily say that I am the hugest proponent you will ever meet to doing anything that will improve the quality of my sleep. And that's because sleep is linked to just about every metabolic disorder we see in our population today. One of the easiest things you can do to improve the quality of your sleep is to get a pillow that can be shaped into the exact form factor that allows you to get your best night's sleep. And that is My Pillow. I've been sleeping with My Pillow for a few years now, and I can tell you that when I have to travel and stay in hotels, I don't get a good night's sleep because I don't have My Pillow with me. Right now, you can save up to 60% off of everything offered to improve the quality of your sleep at shrnetwork.biz/mypillow when you use the code SHR. Or you can call toll-free 800-889-4938. And remember to use code SHR to save up to 60% off of everything at their website. If you've listened to this show for any length of time, you know that I have struggled to give up coffee for years. Coffee has destroyed my gut and it's impaired my health. Well, I haven't had coffee in months thanks to a product called Magic Mind. Magic Mind is the first nootropic blend I actually feel working. One shot and I'm good all day long. My memory is crystal clear and I'm able to function and have great focus without coffee or caffeine for that matter. If you want to try a product that really works, if you're like me and you want to give up coffee forever, or you just need something occasionally that will help you lift the brain fog, Magic Mind is your product. I promise you that this product you will feel when you use it. Go to shrnetwork.biz/Magic Mind, all one word, and use the code SHR for a whopping 20% off your first order. MK Supplements grass-fed beef liver is from 100% pasture-raised New Zealand cattle. Unlike other manufacturers, they use a gentle freeze-drying method to turn fresh liver into a powder before filling it into gelatin capsules. Additionally, they don't use hexane or any other harsh chemicals to defat their organ meat. From the glass container and metal lid they use to package their products to the recyclable shipping materials they use for delivery, their goal is to provide the highest quality, most eco-friendly supplements on the market. Go to shrnetwork.biz/liver and use code SUPERHUMAN to receive 15% off your order today. Verso contains potent compounds proven to increase NAD+. NAD+ is arguably the most important molecule in the body, and without it, you would die in less than 30 seconds. It's responsible for a number of physiological processes, one being that it guides longevity genes called sirtuins to direct cells in the body to perform their jobs. NAD+ levels drop with age, and when they're low, there isn't enough to guide sirtuins, so your cells start to break down. This explains why the body ages and consequently wrinkles appear. There is less benefit to exercise, it takes longer to recover, and an older body is not resilient like a young body. Start reversing biological age now. Go to shrnetwork.biz/Verso and use the code SHR for 20% off plus free shipping on your bottle of Verso today. C60, also known as Buckminster fullerene, is the most powerful, most versatile antioxidant in the world. It's been shown in studies to double the lifespan of rodents. We all know the importance of taking antioxidants to slow aging, reduce inflammation, and improve mitochondrial function and energy production. But there are literally hundreds of antioxidants that would cost you thousands of dollars to take every day. I take one. I take C60 from C360 Health. Revive and Rejuvenate are two blends that harness the power of C60. Don't waste another minute. Go to shrnetwork.biz/revive and use the code SHR for 15% off and free shipping inside the United States today.
This is a Superhuman channel where brawn and brains finally meet.
Welcome back. We're talking with the brilliant Dr. Chris Masterjohn. And now we're going to get into the real topic at hand. So everybody's afraid of COVID. A good friend of mine just caught it the other day in the next office from me. And he's not dead. He's surprisingly, he didn't die. So let's start off with vitamin D. This is a big player. Let's talk about it both from a therapeutic standpoint and also from a preventative standpoint. Does vitamin D provide any value here?
So from a preventative standpoint, it appears that you can cut your infection risk in half by maintaining vitamin D levels between 50 and 60 nanograms per milliliter with a, you could shoot for a sweet spot around 55 and let it go up or down a little bit. And it doesn't eliminate the risk, but cutting the risk in half is a pretty big chunk to bite out. And then for treatment data is pretty controversial because different studies have come to different results. But in synthesizing them, it seems like if you have low vitamin D status and you are 10 to 15 days into your illness and you have respiratory failure, vitamin D probably is not going to help you at that point if you are taking oral vitamin D3. However, at any point, even if you're very sick, it probably would be helpful to follow the Spanish protocol that was used in a randomized controlled trial in Spain, and also has been used in a lot of Spanish hospitals outside that seems to cut the risk of ICU possibly as high as 98%, and seems to cut the death rate somewhere around 70 to 80%. That first figure is from the RCT, which didn't have enough deaths to look at the effect on death, but there were observational studies using the same protocol in Spain that suggested that it cuts the death rate by 70 or 80%. And to do that, you have to use calcifediol, which is basically it's 25 hydroxy vitamin D, which is the form that you actually measure in your blood when you're measuring your vitamin D status. It's the form that your liver makes when you consume the vitamin D. But under conditions of strong inflammation, oral vitamin D is much more slowly converted into 25-OHD by the liver. But also, oral vitamin D, if you take a huge dose of it, takes 5 days under normal conditions to take an effect. And so if someone's already sick and their vitamin D status isn't good, then you probably want to have that person, not probably, I would have that, you should have that person, and you probably need you could do this one of two ways. So one would be there, you can order calcifediol online, but you're going to be taking a lot of capsules, and then you can get a higher dose, but it would have to be prescription from a doctor. But you want 532 micrograms on day 1, and then 266 micrograms on days 3 and 7, if I remember right. Two other times in the first week, and then once a week, 266 micrograms. I think that's the protocol. It's something very similar to that. But for the person who's watching this show, who's managing their own health, I mean, maybe their grandmother or uncle or whatever it doesn't maintain vitamin D status very good, and that, what I just said might apply to those people. But for the people that are watching this show who are probably managing their own vitamin D status, I think if you're keeping it at 50 to 60 nanograms per milliliter, if you get sick, you can do if you're very confident that it's that high, you can probably just do something like 20,000 IU a day for the first week, and then cut it to 10,000 IU a day in the second week until your symptoms are gone. And then if you're kind of in between, then you should probably do a loading dose of 100,000 IU on day 1, and then and then otherwise do the same thing. So like 20,000 IU the first week, 10,000 IU a day after that. Or you could do 50,000 IU day 1, 50,000 IU day 2, and then go on the maintenance dose the same way. That's kind of synthesized from a number of studies, where the most convincing one is the Spanish study. And there was a Brazilian study that found no effect of people of giving 100,000 IU, or maybe it was 200,000 IU, I forget, to people who were basically half dead of COVID. But I think that's easily explainable by the fact that they were giving regular vitamin D, and it takes so long to activate, and those people were already so sick. And then there's other studies that are looking at less severe cases where vitamin D does seem to shorten the duration of the infection and stuff like that, but none of those findings are very interesting compared to the remarkable effects on ICU and mortality rate that were shown in Spain.
It's interesting. When I was doing the research on vitamin D for a blog back in March of 2020, I stumbled upon a study that looked at HIV and a bolus dose of vitamin D, and the 25-OHD had the ability to reduce the viral replication and the viral load. I've never heard that before. I've never heard that talked about. But apparently 25-OHD specifically is very beneficial when dealing with retroviruses in general. Did you see that study too, by any chance?
I haven't seen that study, but vitamin D is well established to increase the immune system's production of antiviral peptides. And so
Like
it doesn't.
LL37, right? That's one of the antiviral, antimicrobial peptides. That's a downstream metabolite of 25-OHD.
Yeah, there's a handful of them. But so that's not surprising to me. I haven't seen that study, but that's not surprising at all. I mean, just generally speaking, vitamin D is probably generally protective against viruses, broadly speaking.
Yeah. And really, the best way to get it is the sun, because there's so much more going on in the skin when it's actually making its own vitamin D. But it's a wintertime, so you have to turn to some other alternative. So again, all of this can be found in Dr. Masterjohn's guide on his website, which is chrismasterjohnphd.com/COVID, right? Is that what it is? COVID
/COVID guide.
Yeah, COVID guide. There you go. So if you're worried about this, just go get the guide and read it yourself. Okay. The other star of the show has been zinc, right? So we hear about zinc, and in fact, it shouldn't be missed to say that the country of India pretty much handled COVID by sending all of their citizens vitamin D, zinc, and I think it was ivermectin. And they estimated it was like $6 US, and they have no COVID epidemic there. Our government, vaccines and masks and all this other nonsense, and we still have the problems we have today. I just want to go on the record as saying that these things we're talking about, it's not like, well, why don't we know about this? Well, a lot of other countries do. But you have to ask your politicians that you voted for why we don't know about that. Talk about zinc and also best dose, therapeutic and preventative.
So the data are not that great on zinc, but I think that zinc has a very important role. So let me explain that. If put COVID aside for a second, and let's talk about zinc in the common cold. So what we know about zinc is there's lots of reasons to. It's definitely the case that that not being deficient in zinc is very protective against viral infections. And part of the reason that that's so clear is that when they put people on experimental zinc deficient diets, one of the first things that happens when your zinc levels start dropping is that people get sick with a sore throat. And so it's very clear that having good systemic zinc status is very protective against getting upper respiratory tract infections. Now, on the other hand, the data on zinc in the common cold are not that great and not very consistent when you are supplementing people with capsules, but they're very, very good for lozenges. And the data on the lozenges very specifically suggest that zinc acetate lozenges are the best treatment for the common cold. And this is because zinc acetate ionizes the most in the mouth, and that the zinc ions spread throughout the nose and throat, and they interfere with the virus getting into the cells to replicate. And zinc gluconate is about half as effective as zinc acetate, although zinc gluconate is much more widely available, and that's what's used in most zinc lozenges that you'd find at the store. So knowing that, and I think part of the reason for this, by the way, is that it's not very easy to impact your systemic zinc status over the short term, right? So if you swallow a zinc capsule, you are expecting this to be released into your digestive tract. You're going to absorb some of it. It's going to go throughout your body. And it's going to be distributed into, millions, billions, trillion cells or whatever. And the amount that you're taking in is really, really small compared to your total body stores of zinc. So if you can have people that have zinc deficiency where their total body stores of zinc are like 30% lower than what they should be. It can take them a year of supplementing 100 milligrams a day of zinc to bring them back up to normal, right? So if you get sick and then you're taking 50 milligrams of zinc, that's like a drop in the ocean of your zinc pool, and it's not going to be very effectively enriching zinc status. So the trials in COVID that have tested zinc have tested like 50 milligrams of zinc in oral capsules, and they don't look good. It doesn't look very effective in those trials, but I wouldn't expect it to, and it wasn't that effective that way in the common cold. And for the reasons that I just said, that's not surprising, right? Um, on the other hand, there are no RCTs of zinc lozenges, but there is an interesting report of 4 cases that came out back in 2020 where there were 4 different patients and they were tracked, and high dose zinc acetate or zinc gluconate lozenges appeared to be very effective in treating these 4 cases. And it's a case series. It's not a randomized controlled trial, so you can always question it and say, well, what if they did something else? What would have happened? Right. But there are some interesting cases where, like, one of the patients dropped their dose down from like 100 milligrams to 50 milligrams and started getting worse, and they brought the dose back up to 100 milligrams and they started getting better again. And they had really interesting correlations with the pulse ox that showed it getting better or worse with the dose of zinc and stuff like that. So it looks kind of convincing. I'll also say that when I had COVID most recently, I found that zinc acetate lozenges were extremely effective at preventing the symptoms from migrating from my lungs where they first appeared into my nose. And I know that's true because, as you know, if I started slacking on them, I would start sneezing, and then I'd up the dose and it would go away. And so I'm very convinced of that. So I personally, and then the other thing is, you definitely want your systemic zinc status as good as it possibly can be by the time you get COVID. So I think that ideally, you measure your plasma zinc and you get it into around 120, which is sort of the sweet spot. A lot of people are going to be 90-ish if they're otherwise healthy, but many people are like 70 and some people are 50, and that's terrible.
Now, what about the idea? I want to just ask you a question at this point. So if you're a big red meat eater, you're getting zinc, right?
You're definitely getting zinc. I don't, whether you have good zinc status.
Okay.
You might measure your zinc status and find that it's surprisingly low given your diet. That happens.
Okay.
I mean, certainly eating oysters, red meat, and cheese are very frequently is by far and away the best whole foods dietary way to have good zinc status. If you don't know your zinc status, then it's a good idea to supplement zinc. I mean, at the beginning of the pandemic, I wrote an article saying like what's the best dose of zinc, and I made a YouTube video that got taken down over this. But I was saying that you basically want to saturate your body stores of zinc, and so you should have 7 to 15 milligrams of zinc 4 times a day, taken in an optimal way for like a year, and that will sort of by the end of the year, you should have very good zinc status, and then you can kind of go on more of a maintenance dose. If you're measuring your zinc status, then you want to get up to around 120, and that's better than just guessing based on the dose you're taking. But you want to make sure that you have good zinc status, even if COVID goes away forever, which is not going to happen. But even if it did, you would want good zinc status anyway, because there's always going to be the flu and there's always going to be the cold and etc. Right. So I think you want to proactively maintain yourself at very good zinc status in that way. And I believe that if you do, there's no good data on this, but I believe that if you do, you will have a much less severe course of almost any illness, no matter what it is, including COVID. And then when you get sick, and this definitely applies to the cold, and I'm very convinced it applies to COVID, and it probably applies to most other upper respiratory tract illnesses, highly ionizable zinc lozenges taken very frequently throughout the day are very effective. Zinc acetate is the best. I like life extension enhanced zinc acetate lozenges, and that's just because of they're optimally formulated to have the most ionizable zinc. But even a zinc gluconate lozenge, it won't be as effective, but it'll be good. But these can be taken like when you first notice a symptom, like a sneeze or something like that. And I would, generally speaking, you can take them every 2 hours while the symptoms persist. But I personally am a big fan of overdoing it when you first get symptoms to the point where the symptoms just go away. So, like if I'm getting a cold and I notice a sneeze, I'll take zinc lozenges and I'll do it every 2 hours if the sneeze doesn't come back. But if I notice then I sneeze 3 times, I'm like, I'm going to keep taking the zinc lozenges continuously until that calms down. And it seems, just based on my own experience, it seems exceedingly effective at putting a plug in anything going on in the nose and throat.
Interesting. Omega-3 fatty acids, since this virus seems to elicit a lot of people call it a cytokine storm, but it's just a overexpression of inflammatory bad actors, and omega-3 fatty acids are supposed to help with inflammation. Is that the link? Is that why omega-3 fatty acids are good if you have COVID?
Well, I mean, the link, I mean, so what we have is 2 RCTs that have shown benefit. One was done with very high dose omega-3s in moderate cases where it showed that they got better faster, and another was done in severe cases with a lower dose, which showed a dramatic reduction in the mortality rate. And both of those kind of have different problems, but they're consistent with each other and they make sense. And so I think it's a no-brainer to try to get your omega-3s up to like 600 milligrams to 1,000 milligrams of some of EPA and DHA per day, because that's easy to do and there's no harm in it, and it's probably good for other things anyway, and it might reduce your COVID mortality 70%. So why not? But I mean, I believe that the most likely reason for that is because omega-3 fatty acids are particularly DHA, but also EPA in the presence of aspirin. Although even that story has been more complicated. So DHA is a more certain resolver of inflammation, but EPA in the presence of aspirin or certain gut microbes also contributes to the resolution of inflammation. And yeah, I mean, if you die from COVID, you probably died not from viral replication, but from the inflammatory response. And anything that puts your body into a better position to resolve that inflammatory response is going to be very effective at should be very effective at reducing the death rate. Or, I mean, not just reducing the death rate, but also resolving any lingering inflammation. So, presumably it could have a role with long COVID as well, although I don't think there are any studies on that.
And I was going to ask this about long COVID. Is long COVID just an exaggerated response of inflammation? Is that all it is?
Well, it's not all it is. There's almost certainly a psychological component to long COVID, because they've done some studies showing that people's belief that they had COVID is much stronger predictor of whether they have long COVID symptoms than whether they have evidence of having COVID.
Really?
So there's definitely I mean, but this is also true of sleep function, right? Like I once read a book when I was in grad school that convinced me that if I only get 2 hours of sleep, I should thank God that I only got 2 hours of sleep. And I noticed all of a sudden my days when I didn't get sleep that dramatically improved 70%, like in my cognitive function and other stuff like that. So there's a vicious cycle. Like sleep definitely hurts your cognitive function, but if your attitude is, shit, I got a terrible night's sleep, I'm going to have a terrible day, you're going to have a terrible day. And if your attitude is like, oh, cool, I got some sleep, I'll go do what I have to do, you're probably going to have a better day. So I'm not saying that long COVID is all in people's head, but that's clearly a component. And so like if you got sick and you're obsessed with, oh no, what if I have long COVID? What if this fatigue is killing me? You're just creating a psychological disposition where you are probably going to be, you're going to feel worse than if your attitude is primarily optimistic and hopeful. So I think that's part of it. But yeah, I think there's definitely a lingering inflammation thing that's going on. And I'm not sure exactly what the nature of it is. It's lingering inflammation, but it's also something more specific. And so very interestingly, I talked to one person who had long COVID fatigue, and got vaccinated, and the vaccine made it go away. And I talked to someone else who didn't have COVID and got long COVID fatigue from the vaccine. So I think there are peculiarities of how people can shift around the specific cytokines to generate specific symptoms. But it's so it's more specific than there is lingering inflammation. But yes, I think it's a matter of lingering inflammation.
Could be, and it could be brain inflammation, right? It could be, like you said a second ago, if you think you're going to have a bad day, you're going to have a bad day. And if you think you still feel sick, you may still feel sick. So maybe some of the COVID we've done shows years ago about the link between major depressive disorder and brain inflammation, right? So if COVID causes this massive immune response of, setting the whole house on fire, and maybe if you have a bad blood-brain barrier, that's quote unquote leaky, I guess they call it, maybe some of that inflammation gets into the brain, and that's what's precipitating your long COVID. Like, your body is better, but you still feel fatigued, you still feel horrible.
That's certainly possible. And Emily Deans did an interesting video that I think should be available on YouTube or Vimeo or somewhere from this past summer's Ancestral Health Symposium on with a kind of a focus on COVID, but also a little bit on the history of what's known of post-viral infection mental health issues. But long COVID is heterogeneous. It's not like everyone who has it has fatigue. There's also people that just have like a cough that never goes away, or other symptoms. So for some people, it might be that brain inflammation is more prominent. For other people, the inflammation is lingering in their lungs or what have you. So I think it's complex and heterogeneous, but it's certainly lingering inflammation is the primary thing going on.
I want to take a break, and when we come back, I want to talk about something that you spoke about that I've never heard anybody. That is a give away.
I can't. Your mic seems to be going out.
Sorry, I have a bad board. I'm ordering a new board. Actually, I ordered it, but they're back ordered. You can hear me now, right?
Yeah.
Okay. I want to talk about this magic amino acid that you are the only one I've heard talk about it.
Yeah.
And it's really fascinating. I want people to stay through the commercial break because this is really interesting. Stay tuned.
Yeah.
We'll be right back with more Superhuman Radio.
New Mass Pro Synthogen X2 just upped its own legendary game. To distance itself even further from the rest of the pack, Synthogen X2 now has double the key active ingredients. If you've ever wondered what steroid-like recovery feels like, Synthogen X2 delivers. See why others compare it favorably to powerful bodybuilding drugs at synthogen.com. Mass Pro Synthogen. When you train with it, you'll gain with it.
If you've listened to Superhuman Radio for any length of time, you know I'm a big proponent of peptides. One of my favorites is GHK-Cu, the blue copper peptide. It has the ability to repair and regenerate more youthful expression of skin cells, reversing the signs of aging. Restore a Cell's Stem Cell Awakening Serum, along with their other products, contains potent formulations of blue copper peptides and only the highest quality organic ingredients. Superhuman Radio listeners can now save 25% site-wide. Go to shrnetwork.biz/blue and use the code SHR25. Remodel your skin today. Being superhuman means being conscientious about the choices we make. White Oak Pastures is superhuman when it comes to raising livestock. They're committed to animal welfare, land regeneration, and rural revival. They responsibly manage the entire process from the pasture to your doorstep. High-quality, pasture-raised, great-tasting meat from a farm you can trust. Full nose-to-tail selections. They even have options for your pet. Go to to shrnetwork.biz/white oak and use the code SUPERHUMAN to save 10% off your entire first order. The holidays are over and it's time to set your eyes on new goals for the new year. In the thick of winter and sick season, it's more important than ever to support your immune system so that you are strong, healthy, and able to tackle your 2022 goals. Did you know that one of the biggest ways you can boost your immunity is by supporting your gut health? It's true. In fact, 70% of your immune system is in your gut. That's why it's time to get Biome Breakthrough. Biome Breakthrough has powerful probiotics, prebiotics, as well as a one-of-a-kind ingredient called IGY Max. IGY Max is a patented egg-based protein that enhances gut health, reverses damage caused by antibiotics, and even helps with immunity threats. By taking Biome Breakthrough daily, you'll eliminate bad bacteria, feed good bacteria, build up your immunity, and repair your gut lining all at the same time. Go to shrnetwork.biz/biome and use code SHR for 10% off and get a full year, no questions asked satisfaction guarantee. Remember those rectangular toaster pastries you used to love when you were a kid? Well, Legendary Foods has just made them better. The new cake-style tasty pastry is like nothing you've ever had before. With 20 grams of high-quality protein and less than 1 gram of sugar, you'll feel like you're cheating, but you're not. Go to shrnetwork.biz/legendary and use the code SHR10 to save 10% off your purchase of tasty pastries. Now available in cookies and cream, red velvet cake, birthday cake, blueberry, strawberry, brown sugar cinnamon, and hot fudge sundae. Go to shrnetwork.biz/legendary and use code SHR10 today. Have you been struggling to achieve results in the gym? Trouble sleeping through the night? Overwhelmed with stress or anxiety? Look no further than Infiniwell supplements. They have designed products to address specific needs like muscle growth, hormone balance, sleep, and anxiety from the first use. Infiniwell helps you live well. Go to shrnetwork.biz/bewell, that's BEWELL, and use code SHR20 and start living well today.
Spit that out right now. This is the Superhuman Channel.
Welcome back. So as promised, Chris broke the news about an amino acid that has some great abilities in the case of COVID. Talk about this. First of all, how did you discover this?
How did I discover it? I was just searching through all the, just trying to do a comprehensive review of all of the nutritional things that were tested in randomized controlled trials for the 7th edition of the COVID guide, which you can get at Masterjohn, Ph.D.com/COVID guide. And it popped up. So arginine is an amino acid that you know, is a building block of the protein. You get it from the protein that you eat. You can also supplement with it, L-arginine. And it plays many roles in the body, but among them, well, actually, so one role that was hypothesized to potentially play a role here that I don't think actually does is that arginine is a limiting factor for the proliferation of lymphocytes. And lymphocyte levels, white blood cells, type of white blood cell, they drop in COVID, and if they drop too much, that's a very strong predictor of whether you die. But in the trial of arginine supplementation, it didn't improve their lymphocyte levels, and it did seem to prevent them from dying, although it clearly helped them get better in terms of respiratory function. And because their lymphocyte levels didn't improve, I think actually what arginine was doing is the other thing that arginine could do, which is that arginine is a donor for nitric oxide production. And nitric oxide has quite a number of roles, but among them are vasodilation. And so if you have something like COVID causing clotting in small blood vessels, then to some degree nitric oxide has an anti-clotting function, but to a much larger degree, it is dilating the blood vessels. And so if you have a clot and the blood vessels dilate, you don't have as much of a probability of a serious blockage in that blood vessel. And then also in the lungs, nitric oxide combines with glutathione to make nitrosoglutathione, which is the endogenous bronchodilator. When, in fact, COVID patients may often be given bronchodilators as part of their treatment just to help with breathing, but bronchodilators are kind of standard treatment for asthmatics. And asthmatics who are taking a bronchodilator in their inhaler, or a bronchodilator plus a steroid. The bronchodilator is just replacing the nitrosoglutathione that's missing from their lungs. Asthmatics have low nitrosoglutathione levels, and if they have an asthma attack that's bad enough to land them in the ER, their nitrosoglutathione levels can go to zero in the lungs at that point. So I view asthma as primarily a nitrosoglutathione deficiency. But in any case, in COVID, if you have hypoxemia, you certainly don't, even though COVID is not primarily a problem of constricting the blood, the bronchial tubes, you don't want constricted bronchial tubes, right? So like anything that you can do to open up the airways is going to help if you are otherwise suffering from hypoxemia. So I think across those roles of nitric oxide, opening up the airways and opening up the blood vessels, I think that's where the arginine is having its protective function. But one thing that is known and was known prior to the RCT is that arginine levels are suppressed during COVID, and they are suppressed in proportion to the severity of the COVID. So a mild case, you get lower arginine levels, a moderate case, you get even lower levels, and a severe case, you get very low levels. And that's driven, this research seems to indicate that that's driven by a particular type of immunosuppressive cell that's meant to sort of cool down the immune response. Mm-hmm. And it seems like in the severe cases that they have more of these immunosuppressive cells are also more common in diabetics and people with cancer. And it seems like in severe COVID, part of what's going on is there's more of these immunosuppressive cells. And so while they might have this cytokine storm that is too much of the wrong kind of inflammation, they are also suppressing their own positive immune response to be able to clear the virus. And you wind up with lower lymphocyte levels as a result, for example. But you also wind up with lower nitric oxide production because you have less arginine, and whatever arginine does across the board is going to get hurt. So in the RCT, this was an Italian trial, and it's actually not finished. So they wanted to have 300 people in this trial, but the results were so compelling that, and these trials, if you read the paper, it sounds like they recruited 300 people, then they randomized. That's not how they do it. They have a plan to randomize 300 people, and as the people come in, they're getting randomized, and the recruitment process is going along in parallel with the actual trial and the results coming in. And so there, people are coming in, and once they have 101 people randomized, they're like looking at the data and they're like, wow, we have to publish interim results on this because these results are so compelling. Meanwhile, they're continuing to recruit and randomize the rest of the 300 people. So at some point in the future, we're going to have the final results with the 300 people. But what we have right now is very statistically significant 7-fold increase in the likelihood of improving respiratory function by day 10. And improving respiratory function by day 10 is a really big deal, because if you're going to die of COVID, you're probably going to be getting worse at day 10, right? So it's not just that you got a little bit better. It's also that you didn't get worse, which was the default. And what's interesting is the people in this study, usually you was kind of, if you're in this field, you assume from past experience that if you're going to do something like nutrition, you got to do it early. And this is so pervasive a thought that even like doctors, generally speaking, will, not that they know much about nutrition, but they will just assume that if someone's really sick, once they're in my care, like it's too late for any of this stuff.
Right.
Which is a terribly harmful thing to believe, especially if you're not reading the research. But this Italian trial was done in people who were basically half dead of COVID. So the inclusion criteria here was 4 things. They had to have was it 4 or 3? They had to have CT scan showing COVID-like pneumonia lung damage. They had to have confirmed, I think it was 4 things. They had to have confirmed hypoxemia. They had to have confirmed increase in the respiratory rate. And they had to have low lymphocytes, which are a major predictor of death. Mm-hmm. So these people have severe COVID. and they have a set of predictors suggesting they'll die, right? And that's when they start giving them 3.2 grams of arginine a day, split into 2 doses of 1.6 grams each. And that's where they get a 7-fold increase in the likelihood of improving their respiratory function at day 10, which is incredible because these people are already half dead and they're and of respiratory failure, and they're getting better at day 10. Like that's incredible. But also, no one in the arginine group died so far, and the p-value of the difference is like 0.24, and so that's way too high of a p-value to say it's statistically significant. But I think we'll be able to say something definitive, at least somewhat definitive. We'll be able to say something definitive or close to that when the final results come out with the 300 people, because if it is reducing the death rate by any meaningful extent, it should be statistically significant when that comes out. But so far, I mean, the possibility is that it up to abolishes the risk of death, because no one in the arginine group died, and several people in the placebo group died. But on top of that, the protection of death is very consistent with the actual clear finding that by day 10, these people who are half dead of respiratory failure are now winding down the respiratory support they need or getting off respiratory support. That's a very incredible finding.
So would this benefit people with COPD as well, you think?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that much about COPD, but I would think so, because I'll say that I think that
COPD have damaged alveoli, whether it's from smoke inhalation or tobacco use. And so pretty much the alveoli are kind of toasted, and they just don't scavenge the oxygen that they used to do.
Yeah, well, my recollection is that there are some studies with NAC in COPD that are positive, and the role of NAC there would primarily be by supporting glutathione.
Right.
And I strongly suspect that if the arginine in the COVID studies had been paired with glutathione, it would have been even more effective, because especially given the results of the study, which showed that it didn't benefit the lymphocytes, that makes me think it's really about increasing nitric oxide in the lungs, in which case it's probably mediated by improving nitrosoglutathione levels, which also requires glutathione to be there. So if you're talking about general damage to the gas exchange function, I don't think that, I mean, I would think opening the airways up would be beneficial, but I don't know that it would be like directly getting at the root of the problem. But I think pairing this with glutathione would be good, and the glutathione itself is and actually nitric oxide also has some independent antioxidant roles, but glutathione in particular is extremely important in multiple ways in the lungs, and that includes protecting from damage, but also regenerating damage. So glutathione is also important just for improving a cell's ability to heal itself and to like multiply new cells to heal a tissue. So I would be more bullish on the glutathione part of that, but I think it's possible that combining the glutathione with arginine would be beneficial.
We have two more topics I want to cover with you, and I know you have other things to do today. The two topics are kind of intertwined, right? Natural immunity versus vaccines, and the CDC's study on natural immunity. Talk about natural immunity. What are we more protected if we got COVID and survived it than if we get a vaccine?
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, they're not mutually exclusive. Obviously, you can get infected and then you can get vaccinated. You can get vaccinated and then you can get infected. And there is some data suggesting that adding the vaccine to the natural infection or adding the natural infection to the vaccine, either one enhances the immunity. Although, probably adding two natural infections together is a lot more protective than adding the natural infection plus the vaccine. I mean, what we know is. I mean, what's very clear, and for some bizarre reason, I mean, actually, it's not that bizarre. I mean, they have an agenda to get everyone.
Yeah, they want to sell vaccine.
But scientifically, it's absolutely bizarre the way that the establishment just denies what is clearly established in literature, which is that immunity from prior infection is equal to or better than immunity from the vaccine in most contexts, is more durable, lasts longer, and in some contexts is wildly superior, and in no context is inferior. And it's probably, I mean, everything that you could possibly note mechanistically about and what's known from previous science would suggest that natural immunity is far more robust to these changes and variants than the vaccine is. And what's particularly clear about this is that the variants are primarily, they're all accumulating mutations in the spike protein. And this is so clearly an evolution in response to the vaccination. Now, I'm not saying the vaccine caused the mutations, but I think the vaccine is what's driving the prevalence of the vaccine-resistant variants, regardless of where they came from. And natural immunity provides immunity to many targets on the virus, whereas the vaccines that are available in the United States are all only exclusively providing immunity to the spike protein. And the fact that these vaccine-resistant mutants keep appearing that just have mutations in the spike protein, that's what's being driven in the prevalence, it just seems very clearly that that's an evolutionary response to the vaccinations. But if you have an immunity from a natural infection, you have immunity against all the other targets besides the spike protein that are not being as mutated in these new variants. And so the data are suggestive in that direction, but also in the absence of hard data, I mean, that should just be presumed that the natural immunity is going to provide more robust immunity to variants than vaccinating yourself against the specific protein that's mutating would. That's kind of obvious.
Wasn't the Israeli study with 2.5 million participants? They showed that a natural immunity was much better than the vaccine. And then Dr. Suzanne Turner came on my show to do a peptide show one day, and she had just gotten over COVID, and she tests herself every day because she's an MD. And she got sick. She was sick for about a day, and she went for the antibody test. And she said that one episode of the infection gave her 46 antibodies, which makes me think that the immune system is intuitive, that it looks at this Rubik's Cube and goes, well, let's see what other it can become. And it produces antibodies for all of that predictively, like against the other mutations that you're talking about.
Well, I mean, we kind of know that. Like, textbook immunology teaches that antibodies go through a process called affinity maturation, where when you first get sick, you make antibodies, you make B cells that can make antibodies that are sort of very generally specific against that thing. And because they're not highly specific, they're not as quick to specifically kill that thing, but they also are a big net that can catch many other things. And then as the immune response matures, these B cells go through high rates of mutation and artificial selection. And so the immune system takes the viral particles and it tries to match them to the B cells, and it says, great fit, you go multiply 1,000-fold. Not great fit, go die over there. And so it gets more and more specific. But if you get a natural infection and then you're exposed to very low doses that don't cause any perceptible illness all the time, like a doctor would be, right? So take Peter McCullough, for example. Dr. Peter McCullough claims he has now reversed this, that you can get COVID twice with Omicron. But in the Delta period, he claimed that you couldn't get COVID twice. And part of this was based on his own personal experience. Jessica Rose, when I interviewed her, which went viral on YouTube, then got taken down, but she knows him and clarified this in a little bit more detail. So part of his experience was driven by the fact that he was treating, after he got COVID, he was treating thousands of patients, of COVID patients with no PPE. And then, the 1,000th patient or so, like, put bodily fluids all over his face, and he got a tingle in his nose and nothing more than that. And so he, after his first case, he's constantly getting boosters from every COVID patient that he sees with no PPE, right? But a booster for natural immunity is boosting along the course of the variants, right? So the first microdose boost from the first patient is going to be different than the 1,000th microdose boost from the 1,000th patient. But along that case, your immune system is constantly getting new stimulation of whatever's out there and is slowly and gradually maturing the immune response in a dynamic way that reflects that, right? When you get vaccinated, when you get the fourth booster, of course it doesn't protect against Omicron very well because you have just retrained your immune system to become even more specific to the original Wuhan spike protein, and you have killed even more B cells that were less specific to the original Wuhan spike protein. So your total antibodies went up, but you basically you killed off more Omicron ready B cells because you went through another intense process of affinity maturation to hone down the immune response even more specifically to the original Wuhan spike protein. So I think, it's not like we have RCT evidence on this, but just basic logic of immunology says that. And to be honest, I've gotten COVID twice. My second case was in July. Around the holidays, there were people that I knew, and to protect people's privacy, I'll just say there were people that I knew that got COVID, and I spent days staying with someone who had COVID and helping them with no protection at all. And I came down with a minor sore throat, and I tested my nose twice with rapid antigen test that tested negative. But I think I probably got COVID a third time, and it was probably a minor sore throat. And I think that was probably really good for me because at this point, if you get COVID and then you wait a year and you spend the whole year trying to avoid COVID, you're probably going to get sick again, right? And you're very unlikely to die. Like in Israel, there was one person in the whole country that was thought to have died of a second infection. So it seems exceedingly not that dangerous to get COVID the second time. But if you're someone like Dr. Peter McCullough, where you have the opportunity to get low-grade minor exposures every day, I don't see why you would not want that, because these microdose boosters of natural immunity, if you can get them and you're not getting sick from it, are probably going to keep your immunity extremely high, but also dynamic and resilient to the changes in the flux of the variants, I would think. And I don't want to preach that this should be policy or anything. Like, this is not well studied. Basic logic should make us ask these questions and think about them rather than hiding the obvious question because we are so afraid to suggest that anyone should ever encounter COVID without PPE.
Yeah, no, I agree. I just have, I want to just cover this real quick. And then a thought came to me. The CDC study on natural immunity, what did it show?
Well, it depends what you emphasize. So their headline was that natural immunity is 5 times less effective than the vaccine at protecting you from a future COVID case. If I made the headline, I would have said, my headline would be, CDC reveals an epidemic of fully vaccinated PCR negative COVID-like illness hospitalizations. And so part of the issue here is they used a test negative case control study. Test negative case control studies are a scam. And they are, so a test negative case control study is where everyone in the study is equally sick. And then they test you for a specific pathogen of interest. And if you're sick and you test negative and you're more likely to be vaccinated, that shows the vaccine is effective. So 90% of all vaccine efficacy observational studies since 2011 have used this design. And it's a scam because what it shows is that the purpose of medicine is not to make you healthy and it's not to stop you from getting sick. It's to make you test negative on something that right. Like that's so
I read a review of these test negative case control studies. There were 4 polio studies that were done on this. In these polio studies, everyone was paralyzed. Okay. And so then they do a stool test. And if your stool test comes up negative for polio, and it's more likely to come up negative for polio and when you were vaccinated, then that shows that the vaccine was effective, even though everyone in the study was paralyzed.
Oh my God. That's so stupid.
What the hell? Right? Okay. So the CDC study had this design, right? So every single person, this comes from many, it's called the Vaccine Data Safety Link System, and it's participating hospitals and healthcare management organizations that submit their electronic health records to a big data set for CDC scientists to analyze. And so they took 200,000 people that had COVID-like illness, and that meant every single person in this study was was hospitalized, first of all, and they were specifically hospitalized for one of or more of six symptoms: respiratory failure, pneumonia, dyspnea, which is trouble breathing, fever, vomiting, or diarrhea. Okay, everyone is equally sick with these 6 symptoms, and they're hospitalized. So then they narrowed this down to the pool of people within that had at least 2 COVID tests, one for their current illness and one before that, but it had to be a certain number of months before that, so they were sure that it wasn't the same case of COVID if it was positive. And then from that set, they whittled that down even further to people who either had a prior infection but no vaccination, or who had a vaccination but no prior infection, so that they could compare those 2 groups, right? So vaccination, no prior infection is vaccinated. Prior infection but no vaccination is natural immunity, right? And so what they found is that even though these people are all hospitalized with COVID-like illness, the vaccinated people they were about 5% likely to test positive for COVID, whereas the naturally immune people were about 8% likely to test COVID. So if you combine the whole pool, 94.4% of these people tested negative for COVID, right? So nowhere in this headline is this big elephant in the room, which is that most people who are hospitalized for respiratory failure, dyspnea, pneumonia, vomiting, fever, and diarrhea, according to this study in all these real life hospitals, they don't have COVID, right? So either the PCR test is meaningless, or 94.4% of these people don't have COVID. So why are we so obsessed with COVID, right? And so then 8% versus 5-ish% is like a 30% relative increase in risk, right? So then they adjust this with a bunch of statistics and say, adjust it for comorbidities and this and that, and they come out with naturally immune people are 5.5 times more likely to test positive than vaccinated people. And that's the one thing that gets in the headline.
Right.
And so all of these people are sick, right? And so, like, if you're hospitalized with respiratory failure, did the vaccine really save you? Right? Like, so like from the design of this, the idea that you take all these people who are equally sick and then your measure of effectiveness is the PCR test, that just reveals that they don't give a crap whether you're hospitalized with respiratory failure. But anyway, so what if you wanted to know, does the vaccine protect you from developing COVID, more or less than naturally immune people? What you want to do is take a random sample of people who are naturally immune and then look at whether they wind up in the hospital. But this design is not doing that. It's taking people who are all hospitalized and then it's sort of back calculating how likely are they to be vaccinated, and does that correlate with whether they test negative? But look, why are 94.4% of the people in the hospital who
why are they if they're sick?
So
go ahead.
Let me put the numbers this way. If you just report what the basic findings of this without an agenda, this is what it looks like. 94.4% of people hospitalized for COVID-like illness test negative on a PCR test, and 85% of them are vaccinated. Oh, that's the thing I forgot to mention. There are 6 times more vaccinated people than naturally immune people in this sample, right? Okay, so 94.4% are negative for COVID. 85% of them are fully vaccinated. What the hell's going on here? So there's some epidemic of COVID-like illness of fully vaccinated people who are hospitalized. What is causing that? And I think there's only 2 explanations. One is viral competition, where the vaccine suppresses the COVID virus and makes them more likely to get a different virus, or these people had COVID, but they had such a strong immune response that by the time they were in the hospital, they tested negative in their nose on the PCR test. But because of their strong immune response was so biased towards the negative cytokine storm, they wound up in the hospital.
Well, there's a third thing here, and that's the glaring fact that the PCR test is not accurate. We know this. Elon Musk tested himself every day 2 or 3 times and would get different readings. And we know that the CDC themselves have said that the PCR test is not effective. So, you know how many people...
Whatever you do, don't test fruit for it or you might wind up dead.
Oh, yeah, really.
There was an African, I think in Tanzania, the guy who disappeared, he had tested fruit and it came up positive.
Oh, I remember that. I remember seeing that on social media. Yeah. It's just fascinating. Look, go to chrismasterjohnphd.com/COVID guide to get all of this and more. And everybody should have this in their house, because I predict that there's going to be other viruses. Trust me. They're already working on gain of function stuff in other countries. You think that they would stop this? The last question I want to ask you real quick. From an evolutionary perspective, what do you think this virus and or the mass vaccination is going to do to humans 100 years from now? Anything?
100 years from now, speaking biologically or just speaking in general?
No, biologically, yeah.
Well, I mean, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that if we adopt this sort of perspective that 100 years go by, we're going to have many other pandemics and many other mass vaccination campaigns. And so I don't know. I mean, we don't know what the long-term consequences of, or even on a 3-year time horizon are of this vaccine. And so I have no idea what would happen with 100 years of 20 different mRNA vaccines that all have biannual boosters. I have no idea.
Yeah. I mean, it's scary to me. I'm wondering if mysteriously 15, 20 years from now, we're going to see a higher case of infertility. And, you can't blame it on the vaccine. Look at all the autoimmunity we have today. Maybe some of it is a result of the vaccines that we got as kids, the baby boomers. We don't know, because it comes down to irreducible complexity. How do you track over 50 years what a vaccine you got as a kid actually did to your immune system? And I'm scared. I really am. I'm scared for the human population right now.
I think we have I mean, I don't think it's irreducibly complex. I think that it is very complex and it's not easy to tackle, but I think we have a much bigger problem where our regulatory agencies basically don't allow us to question certain things. And they are very, very secretive with their data sets. So for example, one basic question that I have, and I haven't gotten time, but I want to work with a lawyer to submit a FOIA request on this, is in that study, the small sample had 6 times more vaccinated people than naturally immune people, but that was out of 7,000 people out of the big sample of 200,000. Does the big sample of 200,000 look the same? That's important to know, because if it does, then that's very strong evidence of that epidemic of fully vaccinated, hospitalized, PCR negative COVID-like illness. And that should be plastered all over the news, right? But in order to get access to that data, you actually have to get a CDC scientist to want to be a co-author with you. No one has access to that data except the CDC.
Right.
And so I am going to work to try to FOIA request that data, but by default, that data is hidden and locked away. And the CDC has just generally been not transparent and it's not an open access thing, right? And so I think our bigger problem on understanding the effect of what, you know, many pandemics and vaccines will be doing to us, our much bigger problem is political and is about accessing the data than it is about analyzing the data. I think I'm very hopeful on our ability to analyze the data, but I think it's going to be a great struggle
to even
over
get your hands on it.
access to the data.
Right. Chris, thanks for being here. It's been too long. Let's do it again, okay, man?
Sounds great. It was
Take
awesome
care.
being here. Thanks, Carl.
Take care. I got one thing I have to plug. I didn't want to interrupt Chris today because the information was way, way too important. But we have a new sponsor I want to tell you about, and it's called Helix. Helix makes a sauna blanket that is amazing. We have 2 of them at home now. Elisa and I have been playing with them. They get up to 180 degrees. They get hotter than most infrared sauna. It's a far infrared sauna blanket. It's kind of like, if you're looking at the show, you see it. It kind of looks like a sleeping bag. 0 EMF. It produces 0 EMF. If you are like me, you know that sauna is really important, especially far infrared sauna. It can help you recover faster. It can cleanse toxins. It's great. But nobody wants to spend $3,000 or $4,000 on a sauna, and many of us don't have the room in our condos or apartments for it. Now you have no excuse. Helix has made a special deal for my audience. It's $474.99 if you order by February 4th and use the code SHR. You will get not only the normal 10% off, but an additional 30% off. And all of this is all a pre-sale. So that means that your sauna won't ship until February 21st. This is a must-have. There's no excuse not to have a sauna, not to have access to a sauna ever again now, thanks to Helix. If you go to the URL shrnetwork.biz/Helix and use the code SHR, you'll get this fantastic offer if you order before February 4th. You'll save almost a total of 30% off and get it for $474.99. It will ship by February 21st. I'm really excited about this because I am a firm believer in sauna. Elisa and I have a sauna at home. We use it all the time, and it's fantastic. And now you can have a sauna. I don't care if you live in a studio apartment. You can have a sauna now. Again, shrnetwork.biz/HEALIX. Go check it out. Use the code SHR. Make your purchase before February 4th. Get it for $474.99. After February 4th, the price goes back up to $500, and it ships by February 21st. Check it out. And don't forget to share this show. I'm surprised we haven't been kicked off LinkedIn already because they usually kick me off for everything. But this is an important show. There's a lot of people out there still struggling with symptoms. They need to hear the show, and they need to know how to get Chris's guide. And thanks for being here today. We'll see you tomorrow with more Superhuman Radio.